the strongest gearing of the brain is called loss avoidance or loss aversion. And that is a survival mechanism which makes us 2 to 2.5 times more likely to focus on loss or potential loss than the equivalent amount of reward or potential, gain. And so it is really easy to focus more on the things that aren't going right than the things that are. That's natural for us. So just flipping ourselves to noticing more the positive things, because they are there. And even if they're not, then to take it to the next stage and bring more positivity into our lives is the mechanism of abundance, which is one of the 6 things, that I mentioned in terms of manifestation, which is changing that gearing to being more abundant in your thinking rather than scarcity, the magnetic desire that I mentioned earlier, and the patience, because sometimes it can take, longer than you would like and you need to keep your motivation going. And there's some other things around it, but those 3 are the main ones to be really aware of.
So that proclivity to perceiving what could be lost, that's just like an evolutionary mechanism again, that's kind of deeply embedded for, fear. Well, is there a reason for that? I try to think of as newborn babies come into this world, what are we biologically wired for? What is nurtured through childhood? And then what we can do about it. So yeah, it's just because obviously having the fundamental Buddhist tenet of clinging and aversion and being aware acutely of what we could lose is deeply within our psychology and biology. Anything else you want to share as to why?
Yeah, so when we lived in the cave, we had threats from predators, from the weather, from tribes that weren't, the same as us or aligned with us. And so to survive, we had to be at least twice as much on the lookout for things that could, things that could bring in disease, things that could bring in scarcity of food. We had to be mindful of those things. In terms of things that we would consider to be rewards today, they were complete luxuries. In cave times, we would only really indulge in those activities if we had a massive store of food, if the weather was really good, if we fought off all of our enemies, So it just wasn't as important to our survival. And that's a wiring that, how I said wiring that's been in your brain from 0 to 7 is really deep and affects everything that you might think about. A wiring that's been in the human species for so long also runs deep. Some of these things do change. So a really sweet one is that in those times when we lived in the cave and we lived in a nomadic hunter-gatherer kind of way, we didn't live in unit families. Men's priority was to impregnate as many women as possible to make sure that their genes survived. And they didn't have to stay and look after them. They just had to make sure that if they, impregnated 5 women, then one baby would survive.
Is that linked to the testosterone oxytocin balance too that we were talking about beforehand?
Yeah, I guess it would be, but we can come to that later. Yeah. In this day and age, most societies do ask that we live in a unit family, that the father stays with the family, after he's impregnated the woman. And for a long time, men would be going against their, testosterone profile to want to do that. But what we've seen in the last, let's say, decade, is that when a man becomes a father for the first time, his testosterone levels drop, and the limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain that I said was the size of your clenched fist, that becomes rewired by oxytocin, the bonding hormone. So the father wants to stay around and protect the baby because he feels bonded to the mother and the baby, rather than feeling competitive with his testosterone. So that means that something that we have changed as a society has actually then created a biological imperative for men and families. But this survival mechanism, it hasn't changed that much, even though our threats now are primarily psychological for most people in the modern world, and not so much physical. We still have that tendency to focus on losses rather than gains, but we are able to override it if we're aware of it.
Amazing. Quick tangent then. Do you want to mention that one piece about... I just find it so fascinating.
Yeah. It's less related to like families,
Yeah.
but it's just to do with sexual interactions between men and women. So when, and you know, I just want to say that the research isn't clear on other genders, and that's why I'm focusing on the, you know, the heterosexual interaction, is that in a sexual interaction between a man and a woman, so the bonding hormone oxytocin that is involved in childbirth, in breastfeeding, in bonding between newborn baby and mum, so it's kind of like the love bubble hormone, that is released by women. And
During sex.
And similarly to the fact that women do have testosterone, but men have about 17 times as much that they're circulating through their body during the day, men also do release oxytocin, but the way that the receptors respond to oxytocin is completely blunted by the testosterone. So what that means in practical life is that if a woman sleeps with a man enough times and keeps releasing these bursts of oxytocin, she is going to bond to that man, aka falling in love. For a man, if they are not already in love with the woman and they're having casual sex, then the amount of testosterone that's circulating at the time will minimize the effects of the oxytocin, meaning that he will not necessarily bond with the woman. And, you know, like I say, whether it's reality shows or listening to your single friends, we do tend to hear this story quite a lot that, you know, well, you know, he said we're keeping it casual, but we were having sex and I hoped he'd change his mind and he didn't, kind of scenario.
Yeah, no, I just think that it's really interesting to look into the biology of that, because that is a common experience I think a lot of people have in the male-female relationship dynamics, especially with sex, if people are having it casually. Before we move on, are there any other ways in which our hundreds of thousands of years human biology now living in modern times is screwing us? Because it's like, it's so recent to have technology and the internet and what we've all become accustomed to, but it's so new to how we've evolved. And so is there anything that sticks out as to how that is a recipe for disaster in certain cases?
I want to slightly push back on the way that you phrased that, because I am getting that feedback on social media. And so what I really want to say is knowledge is power. And I'm saying these things so that if people have experienced that in their personal life, but they weren't aware of the science behind it, that they can use that information to, you know, make it work for them. So, for example, the scenario about, as a woman, you may bond more than you would like to if you repeatedly have casual sex with someone. Knowing that could change, you know, what some people do. So it's good to know, right?
Yeah.
And similarly, we've mentioned a few other things like that, like how the stress hormone cortisol leaks out of your body in your sweat. And so you can get affected by the stress levels of people around you. That could potentially screw with you if you didn't, you know, if you weren't aware of the fact that be aware of who's draining your energy or making you feel super stressed, and either go and sweat that out through aerobic exercise or get it off your mind through journaling or speaking to a friend or therapist. But the main one that I really want to come to, because I've been doing some research into neuroaesthetics recently, or neuroarts, and I've realized the importance of this one thing that has been staring us in the face for as long as we've been humans, but we have become so disconnected from it for all the reasons that you've just mentioned, because we've got devices, because we're switched on 24/7, we have artificial light, is the importance of nature to our health and our mental health. So you and I might have different taste in music or art. Although having looked around your house, we've got definitely similar taste in art. But, you know, we might not. But nature is the one palette that we all agree on, because we've all existed in it since the beginning of time. And I'm obviously not going to say exactly where you live, but when you invited me, you know, to come to the studio, it's such a beautiful place that I've been to before. I wanted to have the drive here and be in that place and see the views, because I know that that will be good for me today. So what has tended, well, interestingly, during the pandemic, we all maybe did actually consciously spend a bit more time in nature. But I have to admit that since I've been able to move back to the city, travel more again, I'm not spending as much time in nature as I did during the pandemic. And that's at the back of my mind that I regret it. But equally, priorities and just like the rush of life again has definitely had a negative impact on that. So when we spend time in nature, we kind of know that it's got, mental health benefits and health benefits. And there is research that shows that if you spend enough time in nature on a regular basis, it actually can increase your lifespan. And not just that you live longer, but you live healthier for longer. But one of the areas of research that I've come across recently is, so I love going on safari. And I learned quite a few years ago that if a tree gets nibbled a lot by a giraffe, and so it's kind of losing its ability to like send the seeds out and grow more of itself, it sends chemical messages in the air to other similar trees around who make themselves bitter so the giraffes won't eat them.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah, I thought that was cool. But wait till you find out my latest thing, which is that trees and plants, some more than others, release chemicals called phytoncides that actually boost our immune system. They trigger the release of natural killer cells in our immune system that can fight off more infections and cancers. So we're constantly, fighting off small infections and cancers and not even realizing that that's happened. Obviously, when they proliferate massively and the immune system can't keep up with them, that's when we become sick. But if you, ideally, forest bathing is where this all came from. But if you go out and spend time, by the ocean or in the mountains or in the forest, even if you have more plants in your house, and, if you have a garden rather than just a terrace or a deck or whatever, then you are getting the benefits of those chemicals from trees and plants. Isn't that incredible?
Just by being in close proximity to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always just felt the benefit from keeping like life, really. It's just plants and now living where I live now, which I moved here about 6 months ago, I totally feel the difference. I mean, it's something that we all intellectually know when we go on hikes or go in the water. We just feel our nervous system be more regulated and suddenly our problems don't have as much of a grip on us.
Totally. Yeah.
But that's wild to see some of the science behind that as well.
Oh, I didn't know you'd only moved 6 months ago. So you're in the kind of time period of feeling that difference. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also feel there's something inherently linked to our human creativity with that. I'm curious if there's anything that came up for you there. There's so much that I want to dive into you with, but I feel like the more that we find ease within ourselves, which can come by product of being in nature more, we get more access to just kind of like this effervescent creativity of wanting to express instead of the alternative.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you've come to that conclusion intuitively. Because when we spend time in nature, what we're essentially doing is beholding beauty. And there's two forms of creativity, beholding and making. And they're connected. They're both good for you for different reasons. But when you are consciously spending more time beholding beauty, which you're doing without even thinking about it by being in nature, then it connects up in that pathway in your brain to wanting to make beauty as well. And so whether that's drawing, painting, singing, chanting, humming, dancing, and again, let's relate this back to when we were in the cave. We were talking about why we would look out for loss more than reward. Well, even before we could speak, we were like beating drums, we were dancing, we were humming, we were doing cave paintings. And we used to think that cave paintings were a way of demonstrating the success of a hunt. But we understand now that it was much more planning the hunt because we couldn't speak to each other. I couldn't say to you, let's go and kill a woolly mammoth today because then we'll have loads of, fur and fat to get through the winter. But I could draw that with you and help, get you to understand that's what my plan was. But in those days, it was literally all about survival. We didn't really do things for fun. Everything had a reason. So why were we dancing and humming and beating drums? And, obviously we were walking barefoot in nature and we were looking at the stars in the sky. So all of that mindfulness, beauty stuff was happening. But we had to be creative as well. Being creative was contributing to our immunity, to our health, to our longevity, to our connections as a tribe. In fact, the authors of the book, Your Brain on Art, Ivy and Susan, they actually count being in nature as a creative activity. So when they quote their research, it's about the benefits of creative activities on your mental health, your health, and your longevity. And being in nature is just another one of those.